All right, last week we looked at Daniel chapter 5, where in October of 539 BC, the Babylonian king Belshazzar, he was throwing a feast, and he was using the sacred vessels that had been taken from the temple in Jerusalem. He was using them as common wine glasses for drinking in praise of pagan gods. And then while he's doing this, fingers appear and write on a wall, which absolutely terrifies him. And at the king's request, Daniel informs the king it was a message from God, the meaning of which was that the Babylonian kingdom was being ended, being given to the Medes and the Persians because of his failings. And that very night, Belshazzar was killed, and someone named Darius the Mede received from God, the kingdom around the age of 62. Now, right when we ended, I was suggesting to you that this character, Darius the Mede, that was just another name for Cyrus the Great. And I explained why I do not think that Daniel chapter 6, verse 28, or Daniel chapter 9, verse 1, eliminate that possibility. And I pointed out that the powers and the prerogatives exercised by Darius in Daniel chapter 6, as we'll see, and the statement in chapter 9, verse 1, that he was made, meaning made by God, king over the realm of the Chaldeans, that fits very well with Cyrus the Great, as does the fact Cyrus turned 62 in the year 539. Now, the last thing I just wanted to mop up that point. The last thing I wanted to say about it is that the Jewish scholars who translated Daniel into Greek, probably around the 2nd century BC is when Daniel was done in Old Greek, and then you have the Greek version attributed to Theodotion, which is done in the 1st century AD, probably. So in those Jewish scholars who translated Daniel into Greek, they seem to recognize that Darius the Mede and Cyrus were the same person. You can see here, for example, the English Standard Version, which is translating the Masoretic text, which is translating what is here, it's Aramaic. You see Darius the Mede. As for me, in the first year of Darius the Mede. And then when you look at the translation of the Greek version, the Septuagint version, so here's the English translation of that, in the first year of King Cyrus. So somebody's making the connection. Okay, they're making that connection, and that's probably because Cyrus was at that time the better known name. So to make it clear to people who's being referred to, it was rendered King Cyrus instead of Darius the Mede. Okay, that's chapter 5. Now moving into chapter 6. This king Darius, who I say is Cyrus, sometimes I'll use the names interchangeably, he appoints, so he comes, the Persians and the Medes, Darius the Mede, he comes and he takes the Babylonian kingdom, October of 539. So he then appoints 120 governors called satraps, and you can understand that, right? You come in, you've conquered a kingdom, you're going to set up the administration of that kingdom in the way you think makes the most sense. So he comes in and he appoints 120 governors called satraps over various provinces of his kingdom, and then he places a panel of 3 men, one of whom was Daniel, over those governors to supervise their activity. So we've got the one level, we've got 120 governors, then he's going to put 3 supervisors over them. One of those supervisors is Daniel, and Daniel stood out. He stood out not only from all the governors, but also from the other 2 supervisors of that 3-man panel that had been put. He stood out from them to such an extent that the king planned to put Daniel over them. He planned to make Daniel the top dog. He was going to be over the governors and the other supervisors. And so the word of this, he was going to grant him authority over all of them. And word of this apparently leaked out of the palace. So this is his intent. Somehow that intent that he was going to elevate Daniel to the highest position, that word that became known, and the other two supervisors of that three-man group that were supervising the 120 governors, the other two of them conspired with the governors to prevent that from happening. You see here, they want to find grounds. They want to take Daniel down. Okay, so that does not happen, so that the king does not give him that position. They plan to do that by finding some fault with how Daniel performed his duties. And that would be the first thing you do. If I want to trash Daniel, he's getting ready to promote him. I want to take Daniel down in his eyes. Well, I'm going to go and find something that Daniel's doing in his current performance of his current duties. I'm going to say, look, the guy's lazy, the guy's not honest, the guy's not doing this right, he's not doing that right. Here, you've put him in this position and he's failing at that position. That would be the first thing. But they can't find anything like that. And so here's Daniel, this servant of God, and he's been put in a high position, and they cannot find anything about how he conducts himself in that position that they could take to the king and trash him with it. And say, no, you shouldn't appoint him. You shouldn't, give him a promotion. I mean, the guy's crummy at the job you've given him. And they look for that, and they cannot find anything. So they decided that they'd have to use, if they're going to take Daniel down, they're thinking, look, we're going to have to use his well-known commitment to God. That's going to be the only way we're going to be able to get this guy. So we're going to have to figure out some way to convert his commitment into God into a negative. Some way that will make him unsuitable in the eyes of the king for this promotion. And these supervisors and governors, they go to the king, and you see it's a conspiracy. They come by agreement. Okay, so they're getting together. They've got this plan, and they come to the king, and they said that they and various other officials, we're all agreed. I'm sure that's made up. Right? But that's part of what they're doing. They get together, they have a plot, they come to the king and say, listen, hey, everybody's down with this. We all are completely on board. Everybody agrees that you need to sign into effect an irrevocable law that anyone who petitions anyone other than you, other than the king, whether a god or man, anybody who does that for the next 30 days, that person should be thrown into the lion's pit or the lion's den. Now this request, it seems odd, right? I mean, it seems to be an odd thing that you're going to go to a king and say, hey, make yourself the sole object of petitions for 30 days. And it may have been tied to the fact that the Babylonian king Nabonidus, Belshazzar's father and co-regent, that he had brought into the city of Babylon the images, the idols of gods from all the temples surrounding the city. So for a good ways out, Nabonidus had gone out and collected all of the images from those temples and had them brought into the city, hoping that would protect the city. So he's got all of those brought in there, and the absence of the idols from those temples would have prevented the priests at those locations from offering prayers and sacrifices, because the representation of their god, their idol, was no longer there. So Nabonidus did that, and this plot that these people have may be tied with that, because after Babylon fell, Darius / Cyrus, he ordered that the idols that Nabonidus had brought into the city of Babylon, he ordered that they be returned to the temples. And so that's what he's doing. And then the return of the idols, that took 4 months for him to complete. And Daniel's opponents, I don't know this, but it's just such an odd thing. I'm trying to figure out, well, how would this have come about that they would have thought this would have had appeal to Darius that he would go along with, that this would be something that would make him more likely to enter the order that they wanted. And I'm thinking that the return, it takes 4 months, and that Daniel's opponents, they may have suggested, look, it would be appropriate during the final month of the return of these idols for the king to declare himself to be, in essence, he's saying that he is the sole priest, the only one to whom petitions may be directed. See, so those who had not yet had their idols returned, he was in the process of returning them. Those who had not yet had their idols returned, they would be pleased with that temporary solution to their worship handicap, because they weren't able to worship properly, to offer sacrifices, because their idols had not been returned. And those who'd already received the idols, they would be open to honoring the king because they were pleased that he had in fact returned those things. So they'd be inclined to go along with it. So what I'm thinking here is that they propose this not only to feed the king's ego, which of course you say, listen, you're such a great king, everybody, the only petition's going to come through to you. But they also, I suspect, pitched it as this is going to be a political plus for you. Because the people who have the worship handicap are going to be grateful as you bring these things back. The people who are, it's going to remind them what you've done and all this kind of, they're going to be happy to honor you. It'll solidify your position. It'll be a good thing. So I think they're stroking his ego, and they're also using some kind of political thing, and then the king signs it. Okay, so whether that's true or not, they were successful in saying, listen, you need to do this. This is going to be a good idea. For 30 days, nobody can petition anyone except you. Now, Daniel, he knows the king's decree. He's well aware of it. He knows what the king has decreed, but he's convinced that it would be serving Darius instead of God. It would be serving this human king instead of God if he were to cease praying to God as he had been doing, meaning 3 times a day facing Jerusalem. So Daniel is convinced, I pray this way, God wants my prayers, he wants my petitions to him. I always do this, have always done this. And for me then to cease in response to this would be to disobey God. God wants me, it would be serving Darius rather than serving God. And this prayer regimen that Daniel has was no doubt tied to Solomon's prayer of dedication for the temple. When the temple was constructed in 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 46 to 51, here Solomon's praying, he says, if they sin against you, for there is no one who does not sin, and you're angry with them, and give them to an enemy, so that they are carried away captive to the land of the... Well, that's what's happened, right? He's taken away as a captive. He's in a foreign land. This is just what Solomon was praying. He says, far off or near, yet if they turn their heart in the land to which they've been carried captive and repent and plead with you in the land of their captors, saying, we have sinned and we've acted perversely and wickedly. If they repent with all their heart and with all their soul in the land of their enemies who carried them captive, and pray to you toward their land, which you gave to their fathers, the city that you have chosen, and the house that I have built for your name, then hear in heaven your dwelling place their prayer and their plea, and maintain their cause, and forgive your people who've sinned against you and all their transgressions that they've committed against you, and grant them compassion in the sight of those who carried them captive, that they may have compassion on them, for they are your people and your heritage, which you brought out of Egypt from the midst of the iron furnace. Okay, so this idea of him praying toward Jerusalem, you see where this comes from. He's praying there because in Solomon's prayer at the dedication of the temple, he's petitioning God, saying, when your people, if the future they're captive, when they pray to you toward the temple, toward Jerusalem, hear their prayer. Hear their prayer. Now, the window being open, it wasn't to be seen. Sometimes we say, well, Daniel, is trying to be... Daniel's in the upper room. He's on the 2nd floor. The window being open was to give him an unobstructed view toward Jerusalem. right? Solomon prays, have them pray for, he doesn't want something, so he's praying toward Jerusalem and he's got things open, so he's got a clear shot at it. And that's what he's doing up there. Tremper Longman, in his commentary, he says, he's not flaunting his rebellion in the face of the king's orders. It's business as usual. It's not Daniel sitting here saying, hey, listen, you're going to say that? Well, look, I'm going to come down here and write it, get in your face. No, Daniel is doing what he's always been doing. He's praying to God as he believes God would have him do. And he feels like, I can't stop doing that because that would be serving the king rather than serving God. So he says he's not flaunting his rebellion in the face of the king's orders. It's business as usual. Indeed, the description of his prayer is a statement that he's neither flaunting nor hiding his religious practice. After all, he's praying in an upper room and with the windows open. He's not on public display, but neither is he hiding from determined spies. Okay, he's just doing what he'd been doing. And Daniel's opponents, they'd agreed to check on Daniel, expecting to find him praying as they knew he did. They understood, right? They said, if we're going to get anything on Daniel, we're going to have to somehow connect it to his devotion to God. Now, that's a good thing to have said about you. And so they go checking on his praying as they're going to expect to find him doing that. And that is indeed what they found. They find Daniel praying in devotion to God. And they then went to Darius and they recommitted him. Right? They'd already gone to him and said, hey, we're all together. We all understand this. Unanimous. Everybody knows this is going to be a great idea. This is a win-win. You need to sign this law that says anybody who petitions anybody other than you for 30 days gets thrown in the lion's den. They then go check on Daniel, find him praying as they knew they would, and then they run to Darius and they recommit him to the law they'd already got him to sign before they mention anything about Daniel. You see, they come here and they came and said before the king, "Oh, king, did you not sign an injunction?" You see, they're tying him to it. Didn't you remember that, right? You signed the injunction that said this, right? Right? You did. You remember that, right? And so they remind him of that, about that thing, of telling him, recommitting him to that law that he had signed. See, without telling them about Daniel. And then after he declared, yes, that's right, the decree stands fast. After he says that, they then tell him that Daniel is in breach. Daniel ignores the decree and makes his petition 3 times a day. All right, now the king was distressed. This isn't what the king had in mind. This isn't what the king was thinking when they got him to sign this thing. Now, whatever he knows about Daniel, whether he seems positively inclined, I don't know if he knows about the kind of man Daniel is. He knows, I know that he knows about Daniel's faith and how he serves God regularly, faithfully. But for whatever reason, he's distressed. Because this isn't the kind of person he's thinking you're going to capture with this thing. That wasn't his intent. So he tries to figure out a way to ignore the decree. He set his mind to deliver Daniel. So I don't know if he put his lawyers on it. He said, hey, find me some way around this thing that I've gone ahead. He looks for a way to spare Daniel. But Daniel's opponents, they reminded him that under the law of the Medes and Persians, look, it's kind of like this is a real high law. Like if you want to think about constitutional status or something. There is a law, an overriding law that's even higher than you, king. There is a law that any law signed into effect by the king can't be changed. You see, so what they're doing, they're basically holding the king's feet to the fire by appealing to the law that an executed law can't be changed, which was something that the people apparently thought was above even the king, so that if the king violated that, if he changed a law that he had signed into effect, it would hurt him politically. Now, kings were very powerful, but no king wants to have his people against him, because no good stuff comes from that. You wind up getting revolts. You wind up having more people who are willing to say, let's get rid of this guy. Now, that's dangerous business, right? Trying to get rid of the king. But no king wants to do something that will, even though he's all powerful, he can just sit there and say, listen, I'm going to have you put to death, you put to death. But he still politically wants to have the support of his people. So they hold his feet to the fire by saying, you know, the law that says that if you sign something that you can't change it, we're reminding you of that. So don't you go wobbly on me, because they want Daniel taken out. And so they hold his feet to the fire. Now, Darius reluctantly goes along with their pressure. And it reminds me, in fact, of how the Jews went to Pilate. You remember when we were studying John, how they held Pilate's feet. Say, listen, what we're going to do. You know, Pilate's looking for a way to let Jesus out. But they wouldn't let him. And so they said, you do that, we're going to go to Caesar. We're going to go and tell Caesar that you let a rebel go. All right, so it's reminiscent, or, you know, it's obviously before, but it just reminds me of that same kind of thing. So Darius, he reluctantly went along with it, but he apparently did not appreciate being politically strong-armed. Okay, he didn't appreciate that, as we'll see. It's indicated by what he did to those people in the end. Okay, but they're the ones who are doing this pushing. And when the king had Daniel cast into the lion's den, he said, may your God, whom you serve continually. So he knows about Daniel. He respects this. May he deliver you. And indeed, the king felt so strong. I don't know if the king's feeling like, listen, I'm killing this innocent man, and that was not what I thought was going on. And he's now feeling played. And so he's distraught about this, that he's winding up killing Daniel. And so he goes here and he feels so strongly about it that he fasts during the night that Daniel spent with the lions. And at the break of day, the king raced to the lion's den, hoping that somehow God had spared Daniel. And he calls out to Daniel, asking if God had delivered him. You know, just sitting here thinking, is this even possible? But he runs there asking, has God delivered you? And then Daniel announces, like, oh, king, live forever. That's just standard talking to a king. Oh, king, live forever. And then Daniel tells him that God sent an angel to shut the lions' mouths and that he was unharmed. I'm thrown here in this lion's pit, and yes, I'm fine. Angel, shut their mouths, I'm unharmed. And he said that God did this because he was blameless, meaning he was faithful before God. And he then added that he likewise was blameless before the king, in the sense that he'd done the king no harm, right? He simply lives faithfully to God. I'm not an enemy of yours, but I don't serve you ultimately. I serve God, and I was serving God. That's all. I'm not your enemy. I've not done anything against you. So he's blessed by God. He sits here and he says that he's blameless before God. He's blameless before the king. And the king was delighted, exceedingly glad. And he has Daniel taken up out of the lion's den. And as Andrew Hill says, the pit envisaged here. Because people wonder about what is the nature of the lion's den. They know there were lions that they kept for the kings to hunt and this kind of thing. But what's up with this lion's den as a means of execution? And Hill says, the pit envisaged here seems to be an underground cavern-like cavity with two entrances. So you would maintain the lions and these things in a like zoo-like area if you want. And then you would allow them, though, a ramp that goes down to this pit if you want to toss somebody in there. And so they could then go down there. They can't get out, and they have to come back, and they're captive over here. They're not living in this pit. Okay? It says a ramp down which the animals might enter, and a small opening in the roof for feeding purposes. So we've got this pit, we've got a roof, we've got a ramp coming down, and then we either lower somebody down, or push them in and let them roll down. And after Daniel's taken out of the pit, the king orders his accusers, along with their wives and children, to be thrown in that very place. Now see, he understands what has happened now. He understands that they manipulated him and tried to play him to remove a competitor because of his job. And the king's just not happy with it. You know, if you're going to mess with the king, you better take him out. Because if he survives your attempt to mess with him and play with him, this is what happens to you. So in go the perpetrators. Their plot foiled. In they go. And, you know, he tosses them, their families, as part of their punishment. And then you see here that the lions are so hungry that they immediately overpower the people. Now, I don't know if they get lowered in or if the doorway is here on kind of a sloping thing that's so that you tumble in. But whatever it is, you've got these lions, they're just ravenous. These lions are starving to death. So when they see these people coming in, they don't wait for them to get to the bottom. You know, it's like a shark feeding frenzy. These things see this thing coming in, it's going like, man. All right, so they're on, and the point of that is they were so hungry that they did this. It highlights the miracle that was performed by God. So it's not like, well, Daniel was in the den and he was spared. It turns out the lions weren't hungry. You know, they were just walking around going, you know, no, I've already eaten. I'm good. It wasn't that at all. They were starving to death. And they'd have chewed Daniel up. But the angel, you're hurting nobody. Okay? So these people, they wind up getting gobbled up quite quickly. And then they get eaten, taken out. And then Darius issues a letter to his subjects. Okay, very similar to what Nebuchadnezzar had done before him, commanding them to fear the God of Daniel, because Daniel's God is the living God whose kingdom shall never end. And he says that God delivers and rescues and works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. One example being this amazing deliverance of Daniel from the power of the lions. I mean, this is serious stuff. You know, people go, woo. He knows how devoted Daniel is, throws him in there, and Daniel says, no, I'm good. God's angel saved me. And so he's saying this powerful God who's able to do this, and he wants the people to know, because like I say, polytheists want the gods to be honored. And so this is what he sends out. And in verse 28, it notes that Daniel prospered under the reign of Darius, meaning the reign of Cyrus. And we're not told that he was appointed to that initial position. You remember what kicked this off was he was going to be elevated, and we're not told what happened with that. Okay, it does say that he prospered, but it doesn't specify. Something else could have come up, and Daniel could have prospered in some other way. But we know that he prospered under the reign of Darius. Now, move to chapter 7. And you recall that in that move, as when you go to chapter 7, we move from relatively straightforward stories of faith under pressure to these bewildering apocalyptic visions. And if you've read them, you understand. As Tremper Longman said in a quote I gave you earlier in the introduction, he says, the simple division between chapters 6 and 7 masks a radical shift in genre and complexity. While children resonate with the lessons of Daniel 1 to 6, seasoned Bible scholars scratch their heads over Daniel 7 to 12. And with the move from simple stories to obscure apocalyptic visions. Now, this is a clue to you that the likelihood I'm off in what I'm telling you is enhanced. Okay? We're in deeper water, more turbulent water. Now, I don't think what I'm telling you is wrong, but the probabilities or the, whatever, the likelihood is enhanced when you're on something like this, because there's a lot of difficult stuff here. Now, Daniel received dream visions in the first year of King Belshazzar, who began his co-regency with Nabonidus in either 553 or 550. Nabonidus comes to the throne of the Babylonian kingdom through a coup in 556, and then 3 years later or 6 years later, 553 or 550, he then elevates his eldest son, Belshazzar, to a co-regency with him. So he receives them, so we're in 553 or 550. All right, so this is before the events that we just looked at in chapters 5 and 6, right? They're in October 539, or 5 is in October 539, and then after that in 6. So it's before those, and here you see this overlapping chronology. And I mentioned that in the introduction. So you see chapter 7, chapter 5 was 539 BC. 6 is after that. Well, now with chapter 7, we're back up to 553 or 550 BC, so before the events of chapter 5. And so what Daniel saw, well, in his visions, Daniel here, what he saw, he receives this dream, and in his visions he saw 4 winds of heaven, all directions, coming from heaven and whipping up the sea. Right? Sea's very turbulent. Think washing machine. Right? He sees this happening, and out of the sea come 4 different kinds of beasts. 4 different kinds of beasts. Now these beasts are said in verse 17 to represent 4 earthly kings. But as verse 23 elaborates, the beasts represent the 4 earthly kingdoms ruled by those kings. So here we have 4 kingdoms that are being symbolized in these beasts from this sea. And Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2 also involved 4 kingdoms, right? And you'll recall, at least I hope, that chapter 2 verse 4 through chapter 7, right? This is in Aramaic rather than Hebrew. So you have this Aramaic section that is there, and I pointed out that it appears that the Aramaic section of chapters 2 through 7 are in what's called a chiastic structure, where you go like 1, 2, 3, and then you back out in reverse order, 3, 2, 1. And so you see here too, you have 4 empires, trial by fire, a king warned. And then we're going to back out in reverse order. A king warned, trial, 4 empires. Okay, so that structure, I think that a lot of times it's hard to know if something's chiastic. And you can read a lot of stuff into it. This seems to me to be on track. And that's significant because it gives us a clue in interpretation. You see that we need to understand verse 7. We can get interpretive clues from chapter 2. Because in the chiastic structure, chapter 7 relates to chapter 2. All right, so this is something that's going on there. Now, what Daniel saw, as I say, they're different symbolic depictions of the same 4 kingdoms. Chapter 7 parallels chapter 2, and what Daniel is seeing are different symbolic depictions of the same 4 kingdoms that were represented in the great image in Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel chapter 2. And you'll recall, those are empires that represent the Babylonian, the Medo-Persian, the Grecian, and the Roman empires. And so what we're going to see here is different symbolic depictions of those same empires. Now they're portrayed here, though, in Daniel's dream, they're portrayed in a way that emphasizes their beastly, fearsome, and destructive qualities. So that's where the focus is now on these 4 empires. They're being symbolized in a way that puts the emphasis on those natures. And the first beast is a creature like a lion with eagle's wings. That's what he sees from this washing machine type thing. Here comes this first beast. It's a lion, like a lion with eagle's wings. And this is widely recognized as a depiction of the Babylonian kingdom. It's widely recognized that the winged lion was a familiar image in Babylonian art. For example, this was taken from Nebuchadnezzar's throne room, the Babylonian king. And you see here, these are wings up here. You see how that wing goes up like that? And that's right from his throne room. And you have other images of winged lions, sometimes with a human head. Statues that you have here. So this is widely recognized and it obviously a winged lion obviously represents a swift and powerful predator. Nebuchadnezzar himself, he's compared to a lion in Jeremiah chapter 4 verse 7 and Jeremiah 50 verse 17. And the Babylonian king, the Babylonian nation, and Babylonian armies are compared to eagles in a number of places in the Old Testament, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Habakkuk, Lamentations. So this is understood. This image here of this winged lion is understood to be the Babylonian Empire. And as Daniel was looking, the wings of this winged lion are plucked off. See, which suggests a lessening of its capability. It suggests a waning of the kingdom, a failing of the kingdom. And this occurred under Nabonidus and Belshazzar, and even before, when you had the three kings after Nebuchadnezzar's death in 562, you had those three rulers, fairly short term, and then in 566, the coup with Nabonidus. So we're on the wane, we're on the downslide. And I think that's what's represented in the plucking off of the wings there. And then the beast is made to stand upright and is given a human mind. Now this is an ironic twist, right, on what happened to the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. Right, he had his mind taken away from him. He was given an animal's mind, and he was reduced to eating grass like an ox, presumably on all fours. Whereas the beast, in Daniel's dream vision, this beast is given a man's mind and was made to stand on 2 feet like a human. So what is this about? Okay? Well, it's hard to be certain about it, but I think this further symbolizes Babylonia's weakening. It further symbolizes the reduction of its ferocity, which is inherent in becoming more human and less like a wild animal. I think this is simply another way of adding to the sense that Babylonian kingdom is on the way out. Andrew Steinman, in his commentary, Steinman says the humanizing of this beast represents the lessening ferocity of the Babylonian Empire under its later kings. Okay? Now you can argue about that, obviously, because you and I are here trying to pull out, what's being communicated. We're a long way away, and we're looking through a glass darkly. But I think that's what's being said here. That's what is the significance of this image. And then the second beast was like a bear that he sees, was like a bear raised up on one side. So it's a bear that's raised up on one side, and he had 3 ribs in its teeth. This is what he sees. It has 3 ribs in its teeth, between its teeth. And it was told, this bear was told, arise, devour much flesh. Now this is a reference to the Medo-Persian Empire. You remember we have, in chapter 2, we have the Babylonians, the Medes and the Persians. Well, we've just seen the Babylonians. This is a reference to the Medo-Persian Empire. Bears are often associated in Scripture, along with lions, as fierce and dangerous predators. And this is confirmed by the 3 ribs between its teeth. So this idea of being a fierce and dangerous predator, and the fact one side of the beast is higher than the other, that is probably a reference to the asymmetry of the Medo-Persian Empire. The asymmetry of the Medo-Persian Empire, the fact that God granted dominance in that, I don't even want to call it an alliance, but in that union, God granted dominance to the Persian side of that alliance. See, just as we'll see in chapter 8, that we have the larger of the two horns. In Daniel chapter 8, verse 3, the larger of the two horns there represents Persian dominance in the Medo-Persian Empire. So the higher side of the bear, that he's on, one side's lifted up, it represents Persian dominance. And the statement there where it says, arise, devour much flesh, that refers to God's authorization of Medo-Persian success. That God is authorizing this. No empire arises apart from God's active will or His permission, but Scripture specifically identifies the Persian king Cyrus as God's chosen instrument, as an instrument of His affirmative will. You see that in Isaiah 44:28 and Isaiah 45:1. So this statement about arise, devour much flesh, it is God's specific authorization of Medo-Persian success because Cyrus is His man. Cyrus is the one who's taking care of his business. And then the third beast is like a leopard with 4 wings of a bird on its back and 4 heads. And Daniel notes that dominion was given to it, again pointing to the sovereignty of God. And this is a reference to the Grecian Empire. This is a reference to the Grecian Empire. Leopards, they are known as swift animals. You see, for example, in Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 8. And one with 4 wings. I mean, this leopard's already really fast. You put 4 wings on this guy. And he's got great direction. He's really fast. And Alexander the Great, you say, well, why would that be something that will represent Alexander the Great? Well, Alexander the Great, I heard that bell. He conquered a huge amount of territory with unprecedented speed. Okay? In just around a decade, he pushes out from Macedonia, Greece, beginning in 334 when he starts his eastward push. And by 323 when he dies, 334 he starts the push, 323 he's dead, and he conquered this much territory. Amazing speed. And of course this is hundreds of years after Daniel's dream. Daniel is being given this, you see, in a vision. Heard that bell? Thanks for hanging in.